Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, the podcast where we explore some of the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. I'm Jack Montgomery, and today we're traveling to Dutch New Guinea in 1961, where Michael Rockefeller, heir to one of America's most powerful families, disappeared under haunting circumstances. His small catamaran overturned off the coast of one of the most remote places on Earth. Some believe he drowned in the treacherous waters. Others think he reached shore, only to encounter something far more terrifying waiting in the jungle beyond. By the early 1960s, the Rockefeller name carried enormous weight in America. The family represented wealth, political power, philanthropy, and influence on a global scale. Michael Rockefeller's grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, had built one of the largest fortunes in history through Standard Oil, while Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was one of the most prominent political figures in the United States and would eventually become vice president under Gerald Ford. Michael grew up surrounded by privilege, opportunity, and expectations that most people could scarcely imagine. But unlike many wealthy heirs of the era, Michael did not seem particularly interested in simply inheriting status and comfort. Friends described him as intelligent, curious, adventurous, and deeply thoughtful. He attended Harvard University, where he studied history and economics, yet he also developed a growing fascination with anthropology and indigenous art. He seemed drawn not toward the polished world of Manhattan elites, but toward distant cultures and places that felt almost untouched by modern society. Michael was driven by a fascination with cultures far removed from his privileged upbringing. In 1961, after graduating from Harvard and briefly serving in the U.S. Army Reserve, 23-year-old Michael joined an expedition to Dutch New Guinea, the western half of the island of New Guinea that is now part of Indonesia's Papua region. At the time, the region was among the most isolated and least explored places on Earth from a Western perspective. Vast mangrove swamps, dense tropical rainforests, winding rivers, and isolated tribal communities made travel extraordinarily difficult. Some villages had experienced little sustained contact with outsiders. Michael's journey was connected to the Museum of Primitive Art in New York, an institution founded by his father. He was especially fascinated by the artistic traditions of the Asmat people, known for elaborate wood carvings, ancestor poles, ceremonial shields, and spiritual rituals deeply tied to warfare and the honoring of the dead. To Michael, these works were not primitive curiosities. He viewed them as powerful expressions of culture and identity. Traveling with Dutch anthropologist René Wassing, Michael spent months moving through Asmat territory, collecting artwork and documenting local traditions. They traveled by boat through isolated river systems, negotiating with villages for ceremonial carvings and observing customs unfamiliar to most outsiders. Michael became increasingly captivated by the region. In letters home, he described the Asmat artwork as astonishingly sophisticated and emotionally powerful. But there was also danger beneath the surface of the expedition. The Asmat region had a long history of intertribal warfare and ritual violence. Dutch colonial authorities had only recently attempted to suppress headhunting raids and cycles of revenge killings. In some villages, memories of violent encounters with colonial patrols were still fresh. Outsiders moving through the region were often viewed with suspicion, curiosity, or hostility, depending on the circumstances. Despite those tensions, Michael appeared determined to continue deeper into Asmat territory. On November 17, 1961, Michael and Wassing departed the village of Agats aboard a small catamaran made from two dugout canoes connected by a wooden platform. Two local teenage guides accompanied them. Their destination was another village farther down the coast, where Michael hoped to acquire additional carvings. Almost immediately, conditions became difficult. The overloaded craft struggled in rough waters approximately 3 miles offshore in the Arafura Sea. Waves repeatedly crashed against the small vessel. At one point, the engine failed. The catamaran drifted helplessly farther from shore as water poured aboard. Hours passed. Eventually, a large wave overturned the craft entirely. The four men clung to the capsized vessel in open water beneath the brutal tropical sun. Sharks reportedly circled in the distance. The shoreline remained visible, but it was far away, separated by dangerous currents and swampy terrain. At some point, the two local guides decided to attempt swimming for help. They disappeared toward shore. Michael and Wassing remained stranded atop the overturned catamaran. By the following morning, exhaustion was setting in. According to Wassing's later account, Michael believed remaining with the boat meant certain death. He reportedly tied two empty fuel cans to his waist as improvised flotation devices and announced his plan. "I think I can make it," he said. Those would become the most famous words associated with the case. Michael slipped into the water and began swimming toward shore. Wassing never saw him again. Roughly a day later, Dutch rescuers finally located the overturned catamaran and rescued Wassing. But Michael was gone. What followed became one of the largest and most heavily publicized search operations in the region's history. Dutch colonial authorities launched an enormous effort involving helicopters, patrol boats, missionaries, government officials, and local trackers. Nelson Rockefeller himself flew to New Guinea to participate in the search for his son. Newspaper headlines across the world followed every development. The disappearance of a Rockefeller heir in one of the world's most remote regions instantly became an international sensation. Search teams combed coastlines, rivers, swamps, jungles, and villages. Nothing was found. No body, no clothing, no personal belongings, no confirmed evidence that Michael had ever reached shore. Officially, Dutch authorities eventually concluded that Michael had most likely drowned while attempting to swim to land. Given the strong currents, exhaustion, crocodiles, sharks, and rough conditions, the explanation seemed entirely plausible. But almost immediately, alternative theories began to emerge. The most persistent and controversial theory was that Michael survived the swim to shore, only to be killed by members of the Asmat tribe. Part of the reason the theory gained traction was geography. The shoreline Michael was swimming toward was not empty wilderness. It was populated by villages where tensions with outsiders already existed. Some anthropologists and missionaries familiar with the region believed it was entirely possible Michael had encountered villagers shortly after reaching land. Then came the rumors. Over the years, missionaries, local officials, journalists, and anthropologists reported hearing stories from Asmat villagers claiming that a white outsider had indeed reached shore and had later been killed. Some accounts claimed Michael had been speared. Others claimed he had been decapitated in revenge for previous Dutch colonial violence carried out years earlier. One especially significant story centered on a deadly Dutch patrol conducted in the 1950s. According to several later accounts, Dutch authorities had killed a number of Asmat men during a punitive raid. In some interpretations of local spiritual beliefs, balance could only be restored through reciprocal violence. A foreign outsider arriving unexpectedly on shore may have been viewed as an opportunity for revenge. Some reports even claim villagers possessed personal items linked to Michael Rockefeller, but proving any of these stories became extraordinarily difficult. The Asmat region was extremely isolated. Communication barriers were immense, and many of the alleged eyewitness statements came years after his disappearance. Stories were often filtered through translators, missionaries, colonial officials, or journalists before reaching the outside world. In some cases, details shifted dramatically from one retelling to another. Still, the rumors refused to die. In the decades after Michael's disappearance, multiple researchers attempted to investigate the claims more deeply. One of the most influential figures was journalist Carl Hoffman, whose book Savage Harvest examined the possibility that Michael was killed after reaching shore. Hoffman interviewed missionaries, anthropologists, and local sources who claimed the story of his death had circulated privately among some Asmat communities for years. According to several accounts gathered by Hoffman and others, Michael may have successfully reached land exhausted and alone before being taken by villagers who believed his death carried spiritual significance. Some stories claim parts of his remains or belongings were preserved as ritual objects. Yet even Hoffman acknowledged that absolute proof remained elusive. No physical evidence conclusively tied Michael Rockefeller to any village after his disappearance. No remains were ever identified. No forensic evidence emerged. And despite decades of speculation, no definitive eyewitness testimony ever surfaced that could fully settle the mystery. There were also other theories. Some believe Michael simply drowned before reaching shore, his body carried away by currents into the sea or mangrove swamps where it would never be recovered. Others speculated he may have died from exposure or injuries after reaching land. The drowning theory remains the official explanation, and from a purely practical standpoint, may still be the most likely. The waters were terribly dangerous. The distance to shore was considerable, and Michael had already spent many exhausting hours stranded at sea before attempting the swim. But the absence of a body has continued to fuel speculation for more than 6 decades. And there is another reason the case continues to fascinate people. Michael Rockefeller's disappearance represents something larger than a conventional missing persons mystery. It became a collision between two worlds. On one side stood one of America's wealthiest and most powerful families, symbols of modern influence, industry, and privilege. On the other side stood isolated tribal communities that were living according to customs and spiritual traditions that many outsiders barely understood. The mystery sits at the uncomfortable intersection of colonialism, anthropology, myth-making, media sensationalism, and genuine tragedy. Even the way the story was covered reflected those tensions. Many early headlines sensationalized the possibility of cannibalism and portrayed the Asmat people through an exaggerated lens of fear and exoticism. Over time, anthropologists argued that such portrayals often ignored the complexity of Asmat culture and reduced an entire society to simplistic stereotypes. At the same time, evidence does exist that ritual violence and warfare were genuine parts of life in portions of the region during that period. Untangling fact from sensationalism became extraordinarily difficult. And that uncertainty is part of what keeps the case alive. Was Michael the victim of a tragic accident in unforgiving waters? Or did he survive long enough to step ashore into a world where outsiders were still viewed through cycles of revenge, warfare, and spiritual obligation? More than 60 years later, modern forensic science has transformed countless cold cases that were once thought unsolvable. Genetic genealogy, DNA analysis, underwater recovery technology, and advanced archival research have reopened mysteries across the world. But the Michael Rockefeller case presents unique obstacles. After all, there are no confirmed remains to test, no verified site of his death, no preserved forensic evidence. And the extremely remote geography that complicated the original search still complicates efforts today. Yet some researchers believe the truth may still exist within oral histories passed down through asthmatic communities. Others argue that missionary records, Dutch colonial archives, or unpublished expedition notes could still contain overlooked clues. There is also the possibility that the mystery has, in a sense, already been solved unofficially, that local communities understood what happened long ago, while the outside world remained trapped in speculation. If that is true, then the real mystery may not be how Michael died, but whether outsiders were ever willing or able to fully understand the world into which he disappeared. Today, Michael Rockefeller's name remains permanently linked to one of the 20th century's most haunting disappearances. His story has inspired books, documentaries, investigations, and endless debate. But beyond the theories and headlines lies the image that continues to linger in the public imagination. A young man floating beside an overturned catamaran in treacherous waters, staring toward a distant shoreline and deciding to swim for it, a shoreline he may or may not have reached. And somewhere beyond that shore lay an unforgiving wilderness, shrouded in a deadly mix of jungle, silence, and uncertainty. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Echoes of the Unknown. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with fellow mystery lovers. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the world's greatest mysteries begin at the edge of a map, where certainty ends and the unknown begins.